A life for a spectacle. That was the law in Widow's Creek. As the Lakota girl's feet left the ground, a gasp stole the air from the crowd. But for Elias Thorn, it wasn't a gasp he felt, but the cracking of an 8-year-old tomb he'd built around his heart. For there, overseeing the grim affair, stood Sheriff Silas Kane, the architect of all his ghosts. The sack of oats slipped from Elias's numb fingers, hitting the frozen dust with a soft thud he barely registered. The November wind howled, a merciless thing that clawed at the faces of the onlookers. But the cold was an old friend. This cold, however, came from within. For 8 years he had walled himself in silence, speaking only to his horses and the endless Wyoming sky. He had buried Thorn, the man he used to be, under layers of routine and solitude. Now that grave was being clawed open. He watched Kane, who leaned against a porch post with a casual air, as if observing the weather. The badge on his chest was a perverse star in the dying light, a symbol of a power so absolute it found entertainment in death. Elias saw the faint smirk playing on the sheriff's lips and knew this was more than an execution. It was a performance, a message written in rope and bone for all the desperate souls in this hollowed-out town to read. The crowd, a collection of faces worn down by hardship, watched with a kind of grim fascination. They were not here to protest. They were here to be reminded of their place. They were sheep, and Cain was the wolf who wore the shepherd's star. Elias looked back at the girl, her body now still, a fragile silhouette against the bruised purple sky. Even from a distance, he could see her eyes were open, fixed on something beyond the jeering crowd, beyond the mortal world. There was no terror in them, only a vast, defiant emptiness that seemed to absorb all the ugliness around her. She had not screamed. That, more than anything, lodged in Elias's throat like a shard of ice. His hand twitched, an old instinct moving toward the empty space on his belt where a knife used to live. Thorn's knife. He felt Kane's gaze sweep over him, a flicker of recognition, a silent, mocking toast. The sheriff knew who he was, and he knew Elias was watching. This was for him, too. A reminder of the day everything burned, the day Kane's laughter echoed over the ashes of his life. The town preacher muttered a final hollow blessing, his words dissolving in the wind. The spectacle was over. The crowd began to drift away, pulling their collars tight against the cold, eager to forget what they had seen. They left the girl to the coming night, a broken ornament on the town's dying tree. But Elias did not move. He remained rooted to the spot, a statue of grief and dawning rage. The tomb had cracked, and through the fissure, Thorn was beginning to breathe again. The silence was over. A debt was coming due. The square was empty now. The lights in the windows of Widow's Creek winked out one by one, the townsfolk drawing their curtains on the crime they had just witnessed. All that remained was the whisper of the wind and the dark shape hanging from the cottonwood. Elias stood there, a solitary figure in the gloom, and let the memory he had fought for 8 years come for him. It did not creep in. It crashed over him like a flash flood. The smell first. Not wood smoke, but the greasy, acrid stench of a life's work turned to ash. He remembered running, his lungs screaming for air that was thick with soot, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw the flames, orange and yellow claws tearing at the sky, consuming the home he had built with his own hands, consuming Anna. He had screamed her name until his throat was raw, a useless prayer to a deaf God. And through the roar of the fire, he had heard it, laughter. Malachi Cain's laughter, high and cruel, echoing in the burning night. Anna had been too smart, too good. A schoolteacher with a mind for numbers and a heart for justice. She had been helping their neighbors with their deeds and records. She found the pattern, the legal trickery Silas Cain was using to steal land from poor ranchers. She had proof, and for that Malachi had silenced her. Elias had arrived home to find not a warning, but a conclusion. His wife gone, his home an inferno, and the Cain's message seared into his soul. He had tried to fight back then, a wild, grief-stricken charge with nothing but a hunting rifle and a broken heart. They had nearly killed him, leaving him for dead in the wilderness. He had survived, but Elias Thorn had died that night. In his place, a ghost named Thorn was born, and then promptly buried. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The wind whipped a strand of hair across his face, pulling him from the fire of the past back to the ice of the present. He looked at the girl on the rope. He didn't know her story, but he knew her fate. She was another Anna, another loose end the Cains had decided to snip. Her silent defiance in the face of death was a mirror of the quiet courage Anna had possessed. In that moment, the stranger hanging from the tree became a symbol of his own colossal failure. He had run. He had hidden in his silence, letting the wound fester, believing it was a form of penance. He saw now that it was just another word for cowardice. A cold, clear purpose settled over him, displacing the chaotic grief. The rage was still there, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was a focused, sharp-edged point of steel. This was not about saving a stranger anymore. This was about honoring a debt owed to his wife, paid in the currency of Cain blood. He would not run from this fight. He would finish the one he had lost 8 years ago. Turning his back on the gallows tree, Elias Thorn walked into the darkness, his steps no longer the weary shuffle of a hermit, but the measured, deliberate tread of a hunter. Elias did not return to his ranch. Instead, he slipped into the deep shadows of the livery stable, a place he knew as well as his own skin. The past was not just a memory, it was a set of tools. From a loose floorboard where they had lain for 8 years, he retrieved a long, dark coat and a sheathed knife. The blade was whetted to a razor's edge, its steel cold and familiar in his hand. He was no longer just Elias, the quiet rancher. He was Thorn, moving through a world he had once mastered. The moon was a sliver, veiled by a conspiracy of clouds. The wind became his accomplice, its mournful howl swallowing the sound of his worn boots on the hard-packed dirt. He moved through the alleyways, a ghost in the town of ghosts. His path a calculated map of blind spots and deep shadows. The windows of Widow's Creek were dark, shuttered eyes, willfully blind to the sin at the town's heart. Elias felt a cold contempt for the sleepers, for their chosen ignorance. He reached the edge of the square, the cottonwood tree a black skeleton against the bruised sky. The silence here was different, heavier. He paused, listening, his senses heightened by the night and the mission. There was nothing but the creak of the rope in the wind. As he drew closer, the moonlight broke through the clouds for a fleeting moment, illuminating the scene. It was then he saw it. It was not just the girl. Tied securely to her back, nestled in a beaded cradleboard, was a child. A baby, wrapped tight against the cold, so still he first thought it shared the mother's fate. But then, a tiny fist, no bigger than a walnut, stirred in its sleep. The sight struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just an execution. It was the eradication of a lineage. The stakes of his silent promise had just grown immeasurably. He didn't waste another second. He scaled the rough bark of the tree with a speed that defied his years, his movements fluid and sure. Perched on a thick limb above her, he pulled the knife. He did not saw at the rope, he sliced it. One clean, decisive cut. He had anticipated the fall, wrapping his legs around the limb and leaning down, catching the girl's slight frame before she could hit the ground with a thud. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of cold limbs and broken breath. On the ground, he worked with grim efficiency. He cut the bindings at her wrists, her skin cold and chafed raw beneath them. A faint, ragged breath escaped her lips. She was alive. He then carefully unstrapped the cradle board, lifting the child away from its mother. The baby stirred again, but did not wake. Cradling the infant in one arm and lifting the woman with the other, Elias retreated, melting back into the shadows from which he came. He did not look back. The town slept on, oblivious to the fact that a piece of its dark soul had just been stolen from under its nose. He moved toward the mountains, a man carrying the weight of 2 lives, the wilderness ahead his only sanctuary. The journey to his ranch was a blur of shadows and burning muscles. The wilderness that had been his prison for 8 years now served as his shield. Elias moved through it with an animal's certainty, the woman a fragile weight in his arms, the child a silent, precious cargo. They reached his cabin just as the false dawn painted the eastern peaks in shades of gray and violet. The cabin was like the man himself, stark, solid, and stripped of anything unnecessary. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. He laid her gently on his own cot, the only soft surface in the room. The fire in the stove caught quickly, its fledgling light pushing back the oppressive gloom. He poured whiskey onto a clean rag, the sharp scent cutting through the stale air. As he dabbed at the raw, angry rope burns on her neck and wrists, she flinched but made no sound. Her endurance was a thing of stone. He handled the baby with a surprising gentleness, his large, calloused hands carefully checking the child's warmth before placing the cradle board near the stove. He worked without words, his movements practical and efficient. It was the language of action, the only one he had trusted for years. Days bled into one another. A fragile routine formed within the cabin's 4 walls. Tashina, as he eventually learned her name was, slowly regained her strength. She spoke little, her eyes watchful and wary, but she cared for her child with a fierce, quiet devotion. Elias kept his distance, leaving food on the rough-hewn table and ensuring the woodpile was always stocked. The silence between them was a living thing, a shared territory of pain that neither dared to map with words. It was a language of mutual respect for wounds unseen. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and shaking the pines, Elias sat by the fire. He did something he hadn't allowed himself to do since Anna was alive. He picked up a small block of pine and his old whittling knife. His hands, clumsy at first, slowly found their old rhythm. He was carving a bird, its wings half spread, just like the ones he used to make for her. He was lost in the motion, lost in the memory, the firelight dancing on his weathered face. "My father, he carved stars from bone." The voice was quiet, raspy from disuse, yet it cut through the howl of the wind and the fog of his grief. He looked up. Tashina was sitting in the room's only other chair, her sleeping baby held close to her chest. She wasn't looking at the bird. She was looking at his hands, at the act of creation. She was not asking a question. She was offering a piece of her own broken past. A memory of a father, of a life before this. It was a bridge built of just a few words. In that moment, Elias saw her. Not as the victim he had cut down from a tree, not as a problem he now had to solve, but as a person who spoke his own silent language of loss. He stopped carving. The air in the small cabin shifted, charged with a profound, unspoken understanding. He didn't need to offer his own story in return. He simply met her gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement, a confession, a promise. In the heart of the storm, within the walls of the lonely cabin, two solitary souls had just found the first echo of a shared humanity. The fragile peace held for another week. The storm passed, leaving the Bighorn Mountains draped in a pristine blanket of early snow. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was no longer the heavy silence of strangers, but the comfortable quiet of two people who had learned to navigate the space around each other's sorrow. Tashina's strength returned in quiet increments. She moved with a newfound purpose, her hands always busy, mending her torn dress with a needle Elias had left on the table, or tending to her son, who she called Chaitin, meaning falcon in her tongue. Elias watched her, and in her resilient spirit he saw a strength that reminded him of the mountains themselves, weathered, scarred, but unbreakable. He found himself cleaning his rifle one afternoon, the methodical click-clack of a mechanism a familiar rhythm. It was a practical task, but it was also a preparation. He could feel the borrowed time slipping away. The silence of Widow's Creek was not a sign of peace. It was the coiled silence of a snake before it strikes. Tashina saw it too. She stopped humming a soft lullaby to Chaitin and watched Elias's hands on the rifle. She understood that his act of rescue had not ended the threat. It had merely dragged him into her war. Her gaze was steady, her decision made. The bridge of empathy they had built a few nights prior was strong enough, she hoped, to bear the weight of the truth. She waited until he was finished, until the rifle was reassembled and leaning against the wall. Then she spoke, her voice clear and low. "They did not hang me for a horse." Elias turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He waited. From a hidden seam inside the cradleboard's thick leather, she pulled a small, tightly rolled bundle wrapped in oilskin. Her movements were careful, reverent. She placed it on the rough-hewn table that stood between them and slowly unrolled it. It was not a map or a letter. It was an official document, brittle with age and water-stained at the edges, covered in elegant script and official-looking seals. "The treaty for the valley," she said, her finger tracing a line of text. "The one our elders signed with the government agents. It gave us rights to the southern basin, to the water, a promise of peace." Her finger stopped on the bottom of the page, where several signatures were scrawled. "But this is not my grandfather's mark. And this date, it is from a year after he was already gone." Elias leaned closer, his eyes scanning the document. He might have been a hermit for 8 years, but he had not forgotten the look of official deceit. It was a forgery. A clever one, but a lie nonetheless. "My father discovered it," Tashina continued, her voice devoid of emotion, a recitation of a story she had lived too many times in her own mind. "He learned that the Canes used this paper to claim the valley, to push my people into the barren lands to the north. When he tried to take this truth to the fort, he had an accident." The final piece clicked into place. This piece of paper was the foundation of the Canes' entire empire. It was the legal weapon they had used to steal, to kill, and to build their corrupt kingdom. Tashina wasn't just a runaway accused of theft. She was a witness and a historian, carrying the living proof of their crimes. Elias looked from the forged treaty to her stoic face, and finally to the sleeping child, Chaitin. He understood now. The weight she carried was far heavier than her own life. It was the memory and the future of her people. His personal war for vengeance had just collided with her righteous crusade for justice. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a powder keg, and the document on the table was the lit fuse. They came 3 days later. Elias spotted the riders while he was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the vast, snowy quiet. He wasn't surprised. He had been expecting them. He saw 2 figures cresting the ridge, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. It wasn't a posse, it was a probe. He finished his swing, sinking the axe blade deep into the wood, and turned toward the cabin. Through the window, he caught Tashian's eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. She vanished from sight, a ghost in her own sanctuary. Sheriff Silas Kane reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his deputy a silent shadow behind him. Kane swung a leg over his saddle, his movements smooth and unhurried. He took off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh to knock off the snow, and smiled a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Thorn," he said, his voice deceptively friendly. "Gettin' colder. A man could get mighty lonely out here all by himself." Elias leaned against the chopping block, not bothering to retrieve his axe. He kept his posture relaxed, his face a stony mask. "I like the quiet, Sheriff. It agrees with me." "I'm sure it does," Kane said, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin, the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, the neatly stacked woodpile. "Had a bit of commotion in town the other night. That Lakota girl we had some trouble with, she disappeared. Rope was cut clean through. Now, who'd be brazen enough to do something like that?" He let the question hang in the air. Elias simply shrugged. "Town business isn't my concern. That's why you wear the badge." Kane's smile tightened a fraction. "Funny thing is, the tracks led out this way, toward the mountains. A small set of prints, looked like. You haven't had any visitors, have you, Thorn? No one seeking shelter from the cold?" The duel was one of words, each one a carefully aimed shot. Elias knew that one wrong move, one flicker of emotion, would be a confession. "The only visitors I get are the elk and the occasional wolf," Elias said, his voice flat. "And I know how to handle wolves." For a moment, the pretense of civility dropped, and Kane's eyes glinted with the predator within. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "A man with your particular past should know better than to pick up strays. Some things are best left alone." The threat was clear, a direct reference to the life Elias had tried to bury. Elias didn't flinch. He pushed himself off the chopping block and met the sheriff's gaze. "The only thing I concern myself with is my land, Sheriff," he said quietly, "and I'm very protective of it." Kane held his stare for a long moment, searching for a crack in the facade. Finding none, he smirked and turned back toward his horse. His eyes lingered on the cabin window, as if trying to burn a hole through the wood to see who was inside. As he mounted, he delivered his parting shot. "Well, you keep an eye out," he said, his voice casual again. "It'd be a shame if another fire were to start out this way. These winters are so dry, and a man alone can't be everywhere at once." The words struck Elias like a physical blow, a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife in an old wound. Kane knew exactly what he was saying. He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock courtesy, and rode away, his deputy following in his wake. Elias stood motionless, watching them disappear over the ridge. The quiet returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the quiet of peace, but the heavy, charged silence before a storm. The wolf had left his scent. The next time he came back, it would be with the entire pack. After Kane's visit, the silence of the ranch became a suffocating weight. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk was a potential threat. Elias knew he could not defend this place alone against a determined siege. Cain would come with numbers and with fire, and a single rifle would not be enough. He needed an unpredictable element, an ace he could play when the cards were down. His mind turned to the only other soul in these mountains who despised the Cains with a hatred as deep and bitter as his own. He needed to find Old Man Hemlock. He left before dawn the next day, telling Tashina only that he was checking his trap lines. The journey took him higher into the Bighorns, where the air grew thin and the snow lay deep in the shadows. The terrain became a treacherous landscape of jagged rock and dense ancient pines. This was a place that did not welcome men. Hemlock's home was not a cabin, but a crude dugout carved into the side of a granite cliff face, barely visible, its entrance shrouded by the branches of a fallen pine. It was the den of a man who wanted to be swallowed by the earth itself. Elias didn't approach directly. He stopped 100 yards out and called the old man's name. "Hemlock, it's Thorn. I'm alone." For a long moment there was no answer. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, as wild and weathered as the rock around him. A long, tangled gray beard, eyes that burned with a paranoid fire, and a massive old buffalo rifle held at the ready. "Thorn," Hemlock rasped, his voice like gravel grinding together. "You're a long way from your hole. The wolves finally sniffing at your door?" "You could say that," Elias said, keeping his hands open and visible. "Silas Cain paid me a visit yesterday." Hemlock spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "That snake is always slithering somewhere. What's it to me? I paid my dues to him years ago." He gestured bitterly at the surrounding wilderness, a kingdom of rock and ice that was all the Cains had left him. Elias knew he couldn't appeal to the man's better nature. He had to appeal to his anger. He was asking about a Lakota girl, the one they tried to hang in town. He let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "She's at my place, Hemlock, and she's carrying proof, paper proof of how Cain stole all this land, yours included." The old man's eyes narrowed. The cynical mask dropped, replaced by the ghost of an old, raw anger. The loss of his land, a fertile patch in the valley below, was a wound that had never healed. It had simply festered in his isolation. "Proof, you say," he whispered. "The original treaty, forged?" Elias confirmed. Hemlock was silent for a full minute, his gaze lost in the distance, seeing a past that had been stolen from him. He was not a man to join another's fight, but a chance to strike back at the Cains, even indirectly, was a temptation he could not resist. "I ain't no gunslinger, Thorn," he finally said, his voice low and firm. "I won't stand shoulder to shoulder with you. That ain't my way." He paused, looking up at the precarious rock formations that loomed over his dugout. "But I know these mountains. I know how they breathe, how they ache. When the time comes, when you hear the real wolves begin to howl, I'll make the mountain roar for you, just once." It wasn't the promise of an army, but it was enough. Elias nodded, a silent thanks passing between the two forgotten men. He turned and began the long trek back down the mountain, the weight of the coming battle still heavy on his shoulders. But now, mixed with it, was a sliver of hope. He was not entirely alone. He had an echo in the mountains, waiting for the signal. Elias returned to the cabin as the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the snow. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. He met Tashina's questioning gaze as he entered, the warmth of the stove a stark contrast to the chill that clung to him. He didn't need to recount his journey or his conversation with Hemlock. She could read the grim certainty in his eyes. "They will come tonight," he said, his voice low and steady. "And they will come with fire." She simply nodded, her face a mask of calm resolve. She bundled Chayton in another layer of wool and placed his cradle board in the small, deep root cellar beneath the cabin's floorboards, the safest place she could find. Her movements were fluid and unhurried, the actions of a woman who had accepted her fate and was now preparing to meet it head-on. Elias, meanwhile, walked to the far corner of the barn. He pried up a set of heavy floorboards, revealing a dark, cavernous space beneath. The smell of dust and something sharp, like ozone and old iron, rose from the hole. With a grunt of effort, he pulled out a heavy iron-bound chest. He brushed away 8 years of dust from its lid and opened it. Tashina came to stand beside him, her eyes widening at the contents. It was not gold or keepsakes from a past life. It was an arsenal. Coils of wire, blasting caps, and canvas-wrapped sticks of dynamite lay nestled in the dark. Leftovers from a time when Elias Thorn was a different man. The tools of Thorn, the man who blasted tunnels through mountains for the railroad, and who learned that the same tools could be used to tear down the works of wicked men.
"I built this place to be a tomb," Elias said quietly, his voice rough with disuse of such personal words. "A place to bury the man I was." He looked from the chest to Tashina's resolute face. "Tonight, we'll see if it can be a fortress instead." They worked in the fading light, a silent, efficient team. There was no need for lengthy discussion. He was the strategist, the expert in demolition. She was his second set of eyes and hands, her keen senses and steady nerves a perfect complement to his focused intensity. He showed her how to run the wires, how to crimp the caps. She learned quickly, her hands as nimble and sure as his own. They did not simply wire the barn to explode. They laid a meticulous, layered defense. A small charge was set near the woodpile, designed to create a wall of fire. Another was buried along the narrow path leading to the front porch, a deadly surprise for the first men to charge. The main charges, in the barn, were wired to a single detonator he kept with him. They were turning his quiet sanctuary into a carefully constructed death trap. As the last of the light drained from the sky, they finished. The traps were set. The fuses were ready. They stood together on the porch, the cabin dark behind them, and surveyed their handiwork. The world was utterly silent now. There was nothing left to do but wait. Elias handed her a spare rifle, its wooden stock smooth and cool in her hands. She took it without hesitation, her grip firm. The time for running was over. The time for hiding was past. The night belonged to the wolves, but this small patch of land and the 2 souls standing upon it would not be taken easily. The wait stretched into an eternity, each second thick with a tension that was almost physical. Then it began. Not with a shout, but with a flicker of light in the distant trees. A single torch, a bold orange stroke against the black canvas of the night. Another appeared beside it, then another, until a menacing line of fireflies began to snake its way down the slope toward them. Cain's men were coming, and they were bringing hell with them. They used the wind as their first weapon. With whoops and hollers, they tossed their torches into the dry grass at the edge of the property. The flames caught greedily, spreading with a hungry crackle, fanned by the relentless Wyoming wind into a creeping wall of fire. The plan was simple and brutal: to smoke them out like rats, to force them from the safety of the cabin into the open, where they could be picked off at will. The air grew thick with the smell of burning pine and sage, the smoke stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. From his position at the darkened window in the cabin, Elias watched the fire line advance. Tashina was a stone-cold silhouette in the barn's hayloft, her rifle resting on the ledge. They did not panic. They had anticipated this. The attackers, drunk on whiskey and the thrill of the hunt, grew careless. Believing the fire and their numbers gave them an insurmountable advantage, 3 men broke from the tree line, charging toward the cabin along the narrow, well-trodden path. It was the exact path Elias had intended for them. "Now," Elias breathed, his voice a low command to himself. His thumb pressed the detonator. The earth erupted. The explosion was not a deafening roar, but a sharp, brutal crack that ripped through the night.
The charge buried along the path sent dirt, rocks, and the bodies of the charging men flying. A scream was cut short, replaced by the panicked shouts of the others. The confident advance shattered into chaos. They were no longer hunters. They were trespassers in a minefield. The remaining men scrambled back for the cover of the trees, their drunken hoots replaced by a sudden, sober fear. Now the real fight began. Muzzle flashes sparked from the darkness of the forest, the crack of rifles echoing across the valley. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Elias's head. He didn't flinch, simply returned fire with a single, measured shot aimed at one of the flashes. A cry of pain answered him from the darkness. From the barn, Tashina's rifle cracked, her shot just as precise. They were a 2-person army, outnumbered but not outmatched. They had the advantage of their prepared positions and the fear they had just sown among their attackers. Everyone's interaction means a lot to me. Please share your favorite number in the comments.
The world devolved into a symphony of violence. The roar of the approaching wildfire, the sharp retort of the rifles, the whistle of lead slicing through the air, and the splintering of wood as the cabin and barn took the brunt of the assault. The fire was getting closer, its heat a palpable, monstrous presence. The attackers were regrouping, their fear slowly being replaced by a more cautious, determined rage. Elias and Tashina were pinned down, a fragile island of defiance in a raging sea of fire and lead. The first wave was over, but the night was young, and the battle for their lives had only just begun. The firefight settled into a grim rhythm. For every shot Elias and Tashina fired, 5 were returned from the darkness. The air was a thick, suffocating cocktail of smoke and gunpowder. The wall of fire had consumed the fence line and was now creeping relentlessly toward the barn, its heat so intense that the wood of the outer walls began to groan. The attackers, wiser now, stayed within the cover of the trees, their muzzle flashes a series of angry, winking eyes. They were trying to bleed them dry, to wait until the fire forced them out into the open.
Elias knew they couldn't hold out for much longer. He was down to his last few rounds for his repeater, forcing him to switch to his sidearm. Tashina from her perch in the hayloft was also firing more sparingly. He saw the attackers beginning to mass on the west flank, preparing for a final overwhelming rush, using the fire as their shield. They would be on the barn in minutes. He exchanged a glance with Tashina across the fiery expanse, a look not of surrender, but of a shared, grim finality. They would sell their lives dearly. It was then that a new sound tore through the night, a sound that did not belong to the battle. It was not the crack of a rifle or the roar of the flames. It was a deep, grating rumble that came from high above them, from the dark, imposing cliffs of the Bighorn Mountains. It was the sound of the earth itself being torn apart. A section of the granite cliff face, far above and behind the attacker's position, gave way. A torrent of rock, scree, and ancient dead pine trees thundered down the mountainside, a chaotic avalanche of nature's fury. It crashed directly into the area where Kane's men were gathering for their final assault.
The landslide was not colossal, but in the fiery, disorienting chaos of the night, it was devastating. Trees splintered, the ground shook, and the air was filled with the sound of shattering rock and panicked screams. The attackers' coordinated assault dissolved into a frantic scramble for survival. The landslide had split their forces, cutting off their line of retreat and creating a new, terrifying front. They were now trapped between the defenders in the cabin, the wildfire on their flank, and a mountain that seemed intent on burying them alive. Their nerve broke completely. All thoughts of the fight were replaced by a primal need to escape. Elias watched the chaos unfold, a grim understanding dawning on his face. He looked up toward the dark, distant cliffs where Hemlock's dugout was hidden. A rare, fleeting smile touched his lips. "The mountain roared," he whispered to the smoke-filled night. The old man had kept his promise. This was the opening they needed. The tide of the battle had not just turned, it had been reversed by a force of nature. "Now!" Elias yelled across to Tashina. They were no longer the defenders. They were the hunters.
With the enemy scattered, panicked, and exposed, Elias and Tashina moved from their cover. The dynamic of the fight shifted instantly from a desperate defense to a methodical, relentless pursuit. They advanced into the smoky haze, their movements synchronized, their purpose clear, to finish this once and for all. They moved through the smoky chaos like avenging spirits. The tide had turned so completely that the remaining attackers were no longer soldiers, but panicked animals caught in a trap. Elias and Tashina worked in grim synchrony, their movements economical and deadly, ending the fight with a final, brutal efficiency. The gunfire sputtered and died, leaving only the hiss and crackle of the burning barn and the low moans of the wounded. A false, bloody dawn, painted by the flames, cast long shadows across the scorched earth. It felt like an ending, but the night held one more secret. A figure stepped out from behind the burning skeleton of the barn, moving with a calm, unhurried grace that was utterly alien to the chaos around him. He was not dirty or panicked. His long coat was immaculate, his boots free of the mud and ash that caked everyone else. He was not dirty or panicked. His long coat was immaculate, his boots free of the mud and ash that caked everyone else.
He walked past one of his wounded men, ignoring the man's desperate, outstretched hand as if he were nothing more than a discarded stone. His eyes, cold and pale as a winter sky, were fixed on only one person, Elias. The air grew still and heavy. The few remaining posse members who could still stand froze. Their fear of the battle replaced by a deeper, more reverent terror. Their true master had arrived. The man stopped 20 paces away, the firelight dancing across a face that had haunted Elias's nightmares for 8 years. It was the face of Malachi Cain. He surveyed the scene, the bodies, the fire, the destruction, not with anger, but with the cool appreciation of a connoisseur. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. "Thorn," he said. The name cut through the air, sharp and cold as a razor. It was not a question. It was a statement. A key turning in an old, rusted lock. "I would know this handiwork anywhere. You always did enjoy making a mess." Hearing the name spoken aloud was like a physical blow to Elias. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The fortress he had built around himself, the quiet life, the carefully constructed identity of Elias Thorn, it all evaporated in the smoke. He was naked again, stripped down to the raw, violent core he had tried so hard to bury. Tashina, standing a few feet away, saw the change in him.
She saw the blood drain from his face, the way his knuckles whitened on the stock of his rifle. She heard the name, spoken with such venomous intimacy, and she finally understood. This was not just a sheriff's brother. This was him, the ghost, the architect of the sorrow she had seen in Elias's eyes from the very beginning. Malachi's gaze flickered to her, dismissing her in an instant. "So this is what you fight for now," he mocked, his voice laced with contempt. "A runaway and her half-breed brat. You never learn, do you?" He took another slow step forward. "Did you truly believe you could just disappear? A man like you? A man like us? There is no peace for us, Thorn. There is only the fire." The scattered remnants of the battle faded into the background. The world narrowed to the 20 paces of scorched earth that separated the two men. Two ghosts from a single violent past, brought together again by fate and fire. The larger war for the ranch was over. The true, final battle was about to begin. The world seemed to hold its breath. The crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind, the groans of the dying, all of it faded into a dull, distant roar. There was only the 20 paces of scorched earth between Elias and the ghost of his past. Tashina took a step back, her rifle still held at the ready, her eyes darting into the shadows for any remaining threats. But she knew, as Elias knew, that this was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. Malachi Kane smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. He unbuckled his gun belt with a theatrical flourish and let it fall into the dirt. "No rifles, Thorn. No more of your little fireworks." His hand went to his own belt and produced a long, wicked-looking blade, its edge catching the firelight. "Just you and me, the way this should have ended 8 years ago, before you ran and hid." This was his stage, and he was the master of ceremonies. He wanted more than to kill Elias. He wanted to dismantle him, to prove that even after all this time, he was the superior predator. Elias did not answer with words. He let his rifle slide from his grasp, its thud on the packed earth a final surrender of the life he had tried to live. He drew the knife from its sheath at his side. It was a simple, practical blade, but in his hand it felt like an extension of his own will. In that moment, he was no longer Elias the hermit. He was Thorn, and he had come home. They circled each other, a slow, deadly dance on a stage of ash and ember. Malachi was fluid, arrogant, his movements a taunting display of confidence. Elias was the opposite. Economical, patient, his feet planted, his body a coiled spring of potential energy. His face was a mask of cold, absolute focus. Malachi lunged first, a feint that turned into a swift slash. Elias twisted away, but the tip of the blade caught his forearm, drawing a line of fire and a gout of blood. "You've gotten slow," Malachi sneered, his eyes gleaming with triumph. 8 years of hiding has made you soft." Elias ignored the taunt, ignored the sting in his arm. He let Malachi press the attack, letting the man's arrogance become his own worst enemy. Malachi saw what he believed was an opening, a flicker of weakness in Elias's guard. With a triumphant cry, he lunged forward, his knife aimed straight for Elias's heart, a killing blow meant to end the duel with a final dramatic flourish. It was the mistake Elias had been waiting for. He did not meet the attack with force. He moved with it. In a single, fluid motion, he sidestepped, using Malachi's own forward momentum to pull him off balance. As Malachi stumbled past, Elias's arm snaked out. His knife did not slash, it plunged, a short, brutal upward thrust into the space just beneath Malachi's ribs. It was a killer's move, born of instinct and an 8-year-old rage. Malachi Kane stopped dead. A look of profound, almost comical surprise washed over his face. He looked down at the hilt of the knife protruding from his side, then back up at Elias. His mouth opened, perhaps to utter one last curse, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. The strength left his legs, and he crumpled to the ground, his life bleeding out into the dirt he had stolen. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The wound in his arm throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the roaring in his ears. He looked down at the man who had haunted his every waking moment and felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a vast, hollow emptiness. The ghost was gone, and in its place there was only silence. The roaring in Elias's ears subsided, replaced by the crackling of the dying fire and a ragged sound of his own breathing. He stood over Malachi's body, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand, and felt the colossal weight of the last 8 years settle upon him. The adrenaline that had fueled him, the cold rage that had given him purpose, now drained away, leaving behind a profound and hollow exhaustion. He had slain the ghost that haunted him, but the act offered no absolution, no sweet taste of victory. Vengeance was just an ending, and an ending was just another form of emptiness. Tashina approached him then, her steps quiet on the scorched earth. She carried a strip of clean cloth torn from her own dress. She didn't speak, didn't offer empty words of comfort or congratulations. Her eyes took in the scene. The body at his feet, the bloody knife in his hand, the wound on his arm that was still weeping blood. Her gaze was not one of judgment or fear, but of a deep, sorrowful understanding. She gently took his free hand and uncurled his stiff fingers, taking the knife from his grasp and setting it aside. Then, with practiced, gentle movements, she began to clean and bind his wound. Her touch was grounding, a silent act of care that tethered him to the world of the living, pulling him back from the precipice of his own darkness. It was in that moment of quiet care that Elias saw him. A shape in the shadows at the edge of the tree line, half hidden by the smoke. Sheriff Silas Kane. He had been watching. He had not joined the fight. He was not a brawler like his brother. He was a creature of manipulation, a wolf who sent the pack to do his killing. He had stayed back to watch the final act, to see his brother put the final nail in Thorn's coffin. Instead, he had witnessed the resurrection. He saw his enforcer, his own blood, lying dead in the dirt. He saw Elias, no longer a broken hermit, but a man who had faced the very worst and was still standing. Silas Kane's face, illuminated for a second by a flare-up from the burning barn, was not a mask of rage. It was a mask of cold, calculating fear. He understood, in that instant, that the game was over. The power he wielded through intimidation and his brother's brutality was gone. He was alone, and he was facing a man who had nothing left to lose. Without a sound, without a single backward glance at his dead brother, the sheriff melted back into the trees. A few moments later, the faint sound of a horse galloping away into the night reached them, a sound of cowardly, strategic retreat. The head of the snake had been cut off, and its body was scattering into the darkness. The immediate threat was gone. A deep, profound silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the settling of embers. Elias let Tashina finish tying the bandage around his arm. His gaze swept over the destruction, the skeleton of his barn, the dark shapes of the fallen men, the land itself scarred and blackened.
He had won. He had protected the woman and the child. He had avenged Anna. But as he stood there, amidst the ruins of the battle, he felt only the immense crushing weight of what it had cost.
If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The sun rose on a landscape of devastation. The rising light did not bring warmth, only a sterile clarity to the carnage of the previous night. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and death. The first task of the new day was a grim one, burying the dead. They worked in silence, a final somber partnership. They gave the posse members unmarked graves on the edge of the property, returning them to the uncaring earth. For Malachi, Elias chose a spot far from the others, a lonely grave for a man who had sown so much loneliness. There were no prayers, no eulogies, only the scrape of shovels against rocky soil. As they were finishing, a figure appeared on the ridge, making his way down the slope. It was Old Man Hemlock, his buffalo rifle slung over his shoulder. He stopped at the edge of the property, his sharp eyes taking in the blackened skeleton of the barn, the fresh mounds of dirt, and the 2 exhausted figures standing beside them. He let out a low whistle.
"Looks like the mountain wasn't the only thing that roared last night," he rasped, his gaze settling on the grave that held Malachi Kane. Elias nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty hand. "He kept his word." "A Kane is a Kane," Hemlock grumbled, though a flicker of satisfaction showed in his eyes. "The world's better off with one less of 'em." Elias walked into the cabin, which had miraculously survived the inferno. He returned with the oilskin bundle, the forged treaty that had started it all. He held it out to the old prospector. "This war started because of a lie on a piece of paper, Hemlock. It should end with the truth." Hemlock looked at the bundle as if it were a coiled snake. "What do you want me to do with it? That's evidence. You're the one who should take it in." "They'd hang me before I said a word," Elias said flatly. "I'm a ghost again. And she," he nodded toward Tashina, who was watching them from the porch, her son in her arms, "needs to take that boy as far north as she can get. She needs to find peace, not another jail cell." He pushed the document into Hemlock's hands. "But you're just a crazy old prospector nobody pays mind to."
Take it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, someone outside of Silas Kane's pocket. Tell them where to look. Tell them what happened here. Hemlock stared at the document, the proof of the life that had been stolen from him. For the first time, he held a weapon that could truly hurt the men who had wronged him. A slow, determined light began to burn in his cynical eyes. He tucked the bundle securely inside his coat. "Cheyenne's a long ride," he grumbled, but there was no refusal in his voice. He had found a purpose beyond just surviving. He was now a harbinger of justice. Without another word, he turned and began his long journey south. With Hemlock gone, a new kind of silence settled between Elias and Tashina. The battle was over. The truth was on its way. Their shared mission was complete. "My sister's clan is north, near the Red Basin," Tashina said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was stronger now. "Chayton and I will be safe there." She was no longer running from something. She was going toward something. She looked at the ruins of his ranch. "Will you rebuild?" Elias shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the valley. This place was a tomb. It served its purpose. He looked at her, a hint of his old self, of Thorn in his eyes, but without the rage. "There's a woman, Mary Hendrick, needs an escort to Denver. Trail is long and dangerous." Tashina understood. He was not going back into hiding. The man who had been buried for 8 years was now choosing to walk in the light, not as a rancher seeking peace, but as a guardian seeking purpose. Their paths, which had converged so violently, were now set to diverge once more. The next morning arrived crisp and clean, the sky a vast, unforgiving blue. The smoke had cleared, but the scar on the land remained. 2 horses were saddled and ready, one for Elias and one he had prepared for Tashina, loaded with enough supplies to see her safely to the Red Basin. They stood before the ruins of the cabin, the place that had been both a tomb and a crucible. There was nothing left to say. All the words that mattered had already been spoken in the language of shared glances, quiet deeds, and shed blood. He adjusted a loose strap on her saddlebag. She, in turn, gently placed her hand on his wounded forearm, a silent acknowledgment of the price he had paid. Her eyes conveyed a gratitude so profound that words would have only diminished it. He met her gaze and gave a single, slow nod. It was a farewell, a blessing, and a promise to remember. Then they turned. Without a backward glance, they walked away from each other. Tashina led her horse north, a solitary figure of unwavering strength. Her child's future her only compass. Elias mounted and turned his horse south, toward the long trail to Denver. He rode away from the ashes of his past, not as a man escaping his ghosts, but as a man who had finally made peace with them. He was no longer a hermit hiding from the world, but a quiet guardian moving within it. Sometimes a man builds a fortress of silence to keep the world out, only to find he has built himself a prison. He convinces himself that peace is found in solitude, that grief is a private debt to be paid alone. But the wilderness has its own laws, and justice, like a river, will eventually carve a new path. It may arrive wrapped in violence and fear, a desperate soul knocking at the door of a forgotten heart. And in that moment, a man must choose.
He can remain in the cold safety of his walls, or he can tear them down and discover the purpose that was waiting for him all along. In the heart of the great wild country, the law is often just a suggestion, but the truth is a force of nature. It cannot be buried forever. Staying human means refusing to let the silence win, refusing to forget what deserves to be remembered. Because the real strength is not in knowing how to hide, but in understanding when it's time to open the gate. Now click on the video on the screen to hear an even better story than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it. Click on the video.